Okay. Our next speaker is one of the Double Finers we've been so lucky to have visiting this year. She's been working at Double Fine since 2002 and has since then worked on an impressive collection of games, including Psychonauts, Brutal Legend, and Broken Age. Please welcome Anna Kipnis.
Okay. Hey guys, I just want to apologize in advance. I'm kind of sick, so my face might start melting. And also, if you've been to a Nordic Game Conference earlier this year, this will seem awfully familiar. So hi, my name is Anna Kipnis. I'm a senior gameplay programmer at Double Fine. I'll be speaking to you today about dialogue in Double Fine games. I want to first tell you about one of my earlier experiences that I had implementing dialogue. I started working at Double Fine in November of 2002 on Psychonauts. And one of the first things I got to work on in the game was this guy, Boyd Cooper. Now, Boyd is an inmate of the insane asylum you get to travel to in the course of the game. He's paranoid, he's fond of conspiracy theories, and likes to mutter to himself as he kind of tries to fit it all together. So I was responsible for Boyd's behaviors and reactions, and eventually the gameplay work and his mental world level. Tim Schafer, the creator and writer of Psychonauts and many other excellent games, he had a really cool idea for Boyd's dialogue that would play during his idle behavior. He wanted Boyd to rant constantly, but have the dialogue be dynamically generated from fragments of sentences that you see there, so that you could listen to him for a while and you would never hear the same sentence twice. And what you see there is a document he gave me with those fragments of lines, which I was to use to construct his muttering. This is what it looked like in the game.
The National Park System in conjunction with the cows. No, wait, I mean, the tuna canneries. Pretty much control everything.
So how is this done? Well, what you see there is a state machine diagram that describes how to construct his lines that Tim made. So for example, you'd pick a conspirator.
The manager of that boy band!
Then pick from a list that could link in another conspirator.
Made a deal back in '68 with...
Then another conspirator.
The dairy industry!
And then maybe there's a victim involved, so first you link them in.
To keep down.
Then pick a victim.
All of us.
And then finish off with a non sequitur.
Did I just think that? Or did someone make me think it?
And so what I'd like to tell you about today is the dialogue systems that we use to create someone like Boyd. And more generally, what I hope to do is to give you a pretty good idea of what it takes to actually get dialogue into a game. Like what kind of assets and tools you may need to do it, how to approach writing gameplay systems for dialogue. And by the way, I'm including under this heading stuff like playing the correct text, sound file, body, face, and lip sync animations, and other game assets associated with a line of dialogue. If you'd like to have dynamic dialogue systems in your game, how to approach doing dynamic responses, conversations, or dialogue trees that take into account and perhaps even modify game state. And last but not least, what you need to do to support another language, or at least keep your options open for translation. So where do you start with dialogue? So in a perfect world, this is how getting recorded dialogue into the game would go. Write dialogue, record dialogue with professional actors, hook the lines up in the game, and done, right? Unfortunately, this is not the reality. To start with, you might not even have a perfect idea exactly how you'd like the dialogue to work in your game. Maybe you'd like text-only dialogue because you're going to have user input a bunch of stuff and then use it in sentences. Or maybe your game is fully voiced and you'd like characters to have complex chatter behavior. Or you'd like to have dialogue trees that play elaborate responses and change game state as a result of player choice. So getting a dialogue into a game is an iterative process, much like a game mechanic would be, or gameplay mechanic. It's not something you can just slap on as an afterthought. It should be symbiotic with the rest of the game. And you're not going to know whether it's truly good until you implement it and actually just try it. And I'll be giving you a broad overview of what our dialogue implementation process is like at Double Fine. Using examples from our Buddha engine that we built for Brutal Legend and that we use for our 3D rendered games. By the way, if you're wondering where this name comes from, the Buddha engine was named after the San Francisco Chinatown bar. And it's a Double Fine tradition to name games after Chinatown bars. I'll also give examples from the Reds engine that we've used for Broken Age and the last Amnesia Fortnite project that we had, Dear Leader. So before I get to the technical part, I want to give you some insights from Tim about writing. Try to design your characters well, even the most minor characters, because it will make your story a lot more memorable. So no two characters would approach a problem or react to events in the same way. And what this really means is creating characters who are specific individuals, not stereotypes. So Tim mentioned, I don't know if you were at the library talk, but he mentioned he has this character chart. Like that's what it is right now. So for almost every character Tim creates, he fills out a character chart like this one, and there's just a basic profile of the character, asking questions to establish facts about them and their personality. The questions are not central to the idea of a character, but for everyone you answer, it makes him or her more specific and therefore more real and memorable. So let's say you've done some preliminary character design work. Whether you've never had dialogue in your game or you're not yet sure how you'd like to have it for a specific project, the best place to start is being able to just represent a line of dialogue in the running game. And this could be very simple, like displaying text over a character's head. And what this will do is let you experiment with how you'd like dialogue in your game to work and whether recorded dialogue is even right for your game. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to be referring to dialogue lines. So I'd like to briefly explain what I mean by that. So a dialogue line is data about how a single line of dialogue should be played in the game. So here's what a dialogue line looks like in the two engines I mentioned. The Buddha engine uses a proprietary scripting language for dialogue data, and Reds uses Lua, but the data looks quite similar. And note the line code there. This code maps to the physical data of a line, like the text associated with it, a sound file, and so on. And we have an offline tool that interfaces with our dialogue database, which contains all the information about each individual line of dialogue. This is what you're seeing there is actually a tool that we built on top of the database. Excuse me a second. And this database is a master list of every single line in the game in all of the languages into which it's been translated. It's used for generating scripts to give to actors when we go to record the lines. It's a tool for writers, audio designers, localization producers, and implementers of dialogue. Our database is organized based on game structure. So the example you're seeing here is from Broken Age, and we've set it up by area and then further by scene. To make life easier for our animators, we break out cutscenes into distinct sections so they can focus on only what happens in the particular cutscene, and that's what you see in blue right there. I recommend having a master list of all the dialogue lines for your game, whether you have recorded lines or text only. By the way, you don't have to write a tool for it like we did in the beginning. You can just use something like Google Spreadsheets. And what you see there is the same data for Boyd's rants you saw in the previous slide, but in a spreadsheet. And aside from the line text itself, the most important piece of data to have for your line is a unique code, which is what you see there on the left. For Double Fine's games, a line code is constructed from an arbitrary string of 4 to 6 characters that we call a scene code, followed by a number, and this is just generated at the time the line is entered. It has no particular significance, followed by the character code. So note that this code is arbitrary. The line might get moved around such that the scene code or the number in its code doesn't strictly correspond to the original setup anymore, and that's okay. The reason to keep the code somewhat human readable is because sometimes it's good for a last-minute sanity check to have some idea of the line's history. And the benefit of using a unique ID for a line is that if the contents ever change, you don't have to track down where the line is implemented. You can just change it in your database. And this is also invaluable if you have writers who are not super technical, because they might have a hard time with code, but spreadsheets are pretty easy to navigate. From this master list, a game asset is generated that is a descriptor of every line in the game. That is, the text, any tags associated with the line, specifications on how to play the audio file and where to find it, and so on. This is the asset our runtime engine consults to fetch the data associated with a line code. It's also key to how we approach localization at Double Fine. So we hand off a script to the people doing the translations from our database, and then when we get the translations back, we store them as part of the data for each line. Since the line code is a unique identifier for our line for all of its translations, we generate a resource file per language and pick the appropriate language file at runtime without having to change any of the dialogue implementation. So a couple of other things I quickly want to mention about localization is that you should make sure the fonts you're using contain all the characters you will need for the languages you plan to support, and make sure you pick the right encoding, which is usually UTF-8. If you have words in your textures, don't forget to enter those into your Dialog database so that your localizers get them and you can localize them. You also need to make sure the game knows how to look up the appropriate texture at runtime. Some other things you might run into if you're considering localizing into Portuguese, be careful because Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese differ substantially. Many European Portuguese speakers actually prefer the English version of a game to the Brazilian Portuguese. And as a result, studios unfortunately often end up localizing only into Brazilian Portuguese because not as many people speak English in Brazil as do in Portugal. Make sure to account for languages with very long words. The typical culprits are German and Slavic languages, and the bugs are almost always inside menus. I recommend writing a debug feature that uses the longest possible string in any languages you support to find these bugs without having to test each language separately. If a phrase is too long, the fix is usually to just abbreviate the words where possible and leave enough room for line breaks. On the subject of line breaks, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Thai often don't use spaces to indicate word breaks. The Thai language doesn't even use punctuation, actually, so make sure you consult the rules for how to do line breaks in those languages if you're using those. So, given a representation of a line, how do we play it in the game? In Double Fine engines, we first give the character the ability to speak. So both Reds and Buddha have a component-based architecture, and what I mean by that is each feature or behavior is implemented as a module, and a bunch of these modules are combined to form a single entity or character, so very similar to how Unity works. What you see there on screen is our in-house level editor for Reds that we call 2HB, which stands for two-headed baby. So if we want a character to be able to speak, we just add a co-voice component, which you can see on Grandpa there. Anytime we want a particular character to say a line, we call into co-voice and send it a piece of dialogue line data. It looks up the data associated with the line code and takes care of displaying the text portion of the line in the appropriate spot, figures out who the speaker should be, and plays any related animations. If there's a sound associated with it, sends requests to the sound engine to play it. So let's just say you're able to display text over a character's head. You'll probably want the ability to play more than just one line and to know when maybe an entire sequence of lines completes, so you can trigger a gameplay event or something like that. And there are many ways to tackle the design of a dialogue sequencer. So for instance, you can think of a sequence of lines as just a linear cutscene, right, in which characters animate, visual effects and sounds fire, and so on based on the timeline of events. And a linear sequence is easy to represent in a graphical tool. So this is our in-house tool that we've used for many years, the cutscene editor, to create cutscenes at Double Fine. We take game assets and stitch them together in here. Our animators, visual effects artists, audio designers, and programmers add various timeline-based commands. So for a dialogue line, the info you see there, let's see. Yeah, the info you see there gets converted to the data structure co-voice expects at runtime. By the way, here's how that cutscene you just saw in the cutscene editor plays in the game.
This day cannot get any worse. What the? Ah!
Very short. Things get trickier if you want your dialogue to be dynamic, logic-driven, based on context or game state. And it may be possible to represent this with a graphical tool, but I really don't recommend you start there. Instead, just start with the data that defines the dialogue sequence and the ability to play it in your game. There is a number of great approaches to dynamic dialogue, and I urge you to check out these fantastic talks if you have access to GDC Vault. This one by Elon Ruskin of Valve Corporation, I think he's somewhere else now, but he was at the time. This is GDC 2012. Called Rule Databases for Contextual Dialogue and Game Logic. And this one by Jason Gregory of Naughty Dog from 2014 about the dynamic dialogue in The Last of Us. The The approach to dynamic dialogue at Double Fine is similar and emerged from our team makeup, where gameplay programmers are largely the implementers of dialogue outside of cutscenes, and we collaborate closely with the writers and the audio team. So where do we use dynamic dialogue in Double Fine games? So one example is reactions to player actions, right? In this video, Raz is going to try out his psychic powers on Boyd, namely telekinesis and pyrokinesis and I think punching.
I'm telling you, I don't know where the milkman is. Stupid crows. They've come for me. They're taking me away. The squirrels brings me. Oh no, it's happening again. Spontaneous combustion from the government LSD tests.
We use dynamic dialogue as a reaction to player choice. In this video from Broken Age, Vala is asked to explain what actually happened at the Maiden's Feast, and the real answer is that she escaped, but the player is actually able to give a different account of events.
Can you guys help me? I need to get back to Sugar Bunting right away.
You're from Sugar Bunting? So that's why you smell like frosting.
What's the big rush? Stay here and float a while.
That's the real answer.
This, friend of mine escaped the Maiden's Feast. Really messed things up.
She what?
What kind of selfish monster would run away from such an honor? Such a joyous occasion.
It can also be used for player expression. So in Dear Leader, we let the player provide their official title and then stamp and then use it throughout the game. Another important use of dynamic dialogue is for telegraphing gameplay information. In this clip from Psychonauts, Kochamara is broadcasting what kind of attack he's going to launch as kind of an homage to superhero shows, and it helps the player counter appropriately, so either by getting out of the way or using the shield power in this case.
Ground vision. R2 avoid. Area attack.
Here's another one from Brutal Legend where a huge monster is attacking Eddie in his car, and right before the attack, Eddie will make a comment about it so that the player knows to slam on the gas.
Oh, here she goes again.
Later on, Eddie and Ophelia are driving over a bridge that's in the process of collapsing, and they shout out things that help the player navigate out of the wreckage.
Besides!
Okay, this is the last jump. No, wait, one more. Now put your hands up for this one, okay?
We also use dynamic dialogue to breathe life into characters, as you saw earlier with Boyd. So the way we approach dynamic dialogue is by first organizing it logically based on how it will be used. So I mentioned dialogue lines before. We use dialogue sets to organize dialogue lines into a logical collection. The set contains instructions about how the entire set of lines should be played. What this does is provide us with more options for organizing dialogue and lets us use dialogue in more creative ways. A dialogue set can represent a linear sequence of line from one character. Note the little pauses before each line, which allows us to fine-tune the timing of the lines instead of like baking it directly into a WAV file. And here's how this dialogue set plays in the game. It's the spoon getting anxious about not getting picked up by the player.
Good morning, Commander Shea. It is my honor to be your trading spoon today. Can't wait to start Mission Nutrition. So just pick me up and we'll start filling you up with space fuel. Is something wrong, Commander Shea? Please say something, Commander. Are you waiting for another spoon? We could send in a replacement, but I have to let you know I requested this mission specifically. I was on a waiting list for months. Even though you've been very hard on us spoons in the past, even cruel, I just wanted you to know that working with you has been my lifelong dream. Oh God, I'm so embarrassed. I'll just shut up now. But seriously, you sure eat. Many important missions today. Okay, shutting up. Stupid.
So it's also easy to represent conversations in this way simply by specifying the speaker. This is how we represented Ophelia and Eddie talking while driving in the clip you saw earlier. The set could also be a collection of dialogue lines from which the game can choose randomly. For instance, when this set gets played in a game, the sequencer will pick just one line from these and then stop. A feature I particularly like is being able to pick lines from two different sets. So what you see there picks a line from a dialogue set where Shay is excited to break free into space, and then from another dialogue set where he's disappointed because he's still attached by the hose. And this is how it'll work in the game.
Space! Why is my air hose so short? Woo! Man! Can't catch me this time! Come on.
So in short, there are some features for dialogue systems that have proven extremely useful over the years in Double Fine games, and I've decided to kind of break them up into basic and advanced features. So for the baseline features, in-engine representation of the line, that is the ability to play audio, display text content, or both, and to have data on the line's duration. In-engine indication of which entity should say the line. So as I showed earlier, you can use this setting to implement conversations in a single dialogue set so that every other line has a different speaker, if that's what you want. How long to pause before the line is played, both per line and per set. Because sometimes you don't want the line to start immediately or might want some additional control over timing, and it's much better to do that in a dynamic way rather than edit the sound file by hand. Whether to pick one line to play from the dialogue set or to play them all. This makes dialogue sets useful for representing a single line interaction or something like long conversations. Ability to play lines sequentially or randomly. These features are used to make dialogue sets more versatile, as I showed before. Last but not least, the ability to play animations that go with the line. If you have lines that play outside of cutscenes, you probably want the talk animation on the body, like a generic or a custom one based on the data associated with the line. And the ability to play mouth flap or lip sync animations. So for some more advanced features, weighted random selection of lines. This is useful for reactions to common game events that fire often, like getting hit. So you might want to have a high probability on the normal sound.
Ugh!
Than on the line like this.
You better hope you didn't just give me an infection.
Those are both like hit reactions in Brutal Legend. Ability to specify how long to wait after a particular dialogue set has played before it plays again. Ability to sequence a set of other dialogue sets in addition to dialogue lines. Choosing which dialogue set to play based on priority. So for instance, if you're in the middle of an important dramatic exchange with a character, you probably don't want to hear them react to like seeing a cool collectible somewhere nearby. So you would label the collectible reaction as lower priority than the critical dialogue. Another really great feature to have is the ability to specify whether a line can be interrupted. This feature really came in handy on Brutal Legend, so I'll show you something. Like early on in the game, Eddie got to ride this crazy altar walker, and Tim wrote lines of dialogue that Eddie would say when the walker was stopped, so praying to the metal gods to start it moving again.
Oh man, gotta get this thing moving. Let's see here. Evil,
So kind of hesitant, like Eddie is unsure of himself, and lines that Eddie would sort of chant when the walker moved to encourage the thing to keep moving.
Dear evil, messed up demon powers of darkness, and unimaginable evil.
So like, much more confident sounding than the stop dialogue. The problem is that to move the walker in the game, the player just had to hold down the stick in a direction, and to stop, the player could simply let go of the stick. So as you can imagine, this is very easy to do on a controller. So you could very quickly toggle the walker between the two states, and this would prompt Eddie to interrupt himself over and over, and the result was totally chaotic, kind of like this.
Oh man, dear evil, gotta get this of darkness. Let's and unimaginable.
Kind of impossible to tell what Eddie's even saying there. So instead, we set up these dialogue sets to finish playing as their interrupt behavior. So if a line was already playing, it was allowed to finish before a line from the new state played. And here's how it sounded in the final game. You can see that sometimes the dialogue doesn't perfectly align with the state the walker is in, but it's a much better experience for the player, and it still conveys the spirit of the dialogue.
Oh man. Gotta get this thing moving. Let's see here. Evil. Powerful. Majestic? Slithering? Dear evil, messed up demon powers of darkness. And unimaginable. No, not heavenly. Sulfur smelling? Dear. Wait, should I say dear? Oh, hellish beings of evil. Please transport me off this awesome corpse pile. I am but a visitor in your strange world, which some would call hellish, but I have to admit, it's kind of bad. Demons of the underworld. Demonic authorities? To whom it may, oh evil God. Man, this is tough. Oh lords of gross leather things and S&M type wear. You know, you guys really have style. That battle nun? She was hot. Sorry about killing her, but you're evil though, right? So we're cool. I didn't even know I could do that with an axe. By your good graces. I meant evil! Evil graces! Ah, son of a...
So back to our feature list, to one of my favorite features, which is the ability to set up logic for which lines or sets to select for play based on game state. And that brings us to dynamic dialogue systems. Once there's a way to represent and sequence dialogue lines in the game, you can build on that dialogue set data structure to give characters a lot of depth, to let them react to things happening to them and around them in a much more dynamic way. And I will present a couple of examples. On Brutal Legend, we had stage battles where a lot of characters were kind of fighting side by side, getting hit, firing off clever one-liners, and generally reacting to all sorts of things that were going on, all of which had to be vocalized and to sound good. And as I mentioned before, the Buddha engine is a component-based architecture, so the events to which all these characters were responding were coming from all over the code base. And it would have been an authoring nightmare to have dialogue lines hooked up in every single component. So what we did instead was to fire off an event that something has happened in a character's component. And if the co-voice component had a reaction to it, it would fire off. And if it didn't have a reaction, or if something more important was being said at the time, nothing would be spoken by the character. And the data co-voice checked looked like this. On the left side is the dialogue type, and on the right side is just the dialogue set reaction we want to play. And it's just a normal dialogue set. These are all optional. If you don't want the character to have a reaction to something, you simply leave the mapping out. And the rules that determined which of these dialogue events would fire were in the components themselves. It allowed us to create hooks for these reactions very quickly as gameplay programmers. But if you have writers who don't mind a bit of scripting and debugging, I recommend you check out that Elon Ruskin and Jason Gregory talks I mentioned before about using fact dictionaries to construct a simple scripting language that can define these rules in the dialogue data itself. I'd like to give you some examples of a dialogue system where we did use rule evaluation in the data. One is dialogue trees in Broken Age. So think of each dialogue choice you see there as a node, and each level of depth in the dialogue tree is a collection of nodes. So that's like another set of nodes. Here's what a single dialogue tree node looks like under the hood. Each dialogue choice has a display line code associated with it, a reaction to play when it gets chosen, usually a bunch of dialogue, and a bunch of logic that defines whether it should appear or not. In Broken Age, our game state is a collection of various facts about the game, that is, numbers, strings, and booleans that are keyed off a symbolic string. And this enables us to have a very simple way to represent logic in dialogue tree data as a sort of scripting shorthand. So whether a dialect choice appears or not is determined from the following checks. Appears when, so everything on this list has to check out before the node will be shown. Appears when any, at least one of the things on this list has to be true to show this node. And similarly, the disappears checks. Disappears when everything on this list has to pass the test before the node will be hidden. And disappears when any, where if a single item on this list is true, the node will be hidden. And when picking a node, it can additionally set some logic, which can be used to turn itself off, for instance. We found this to be expressive and flexible on dialogue trees in Broken Age. And so we've also applied this for dialogue lines, dialect sets, I guess, to make it much easier to author very custom reactions for a character. So let me walk you through an example of dynamically choosing dialogue lines based on game state in Broken Age. So let's say that we want Bella to say a line as she exits one scene and a second follow-up line when she enters another. By the way, I should mention that this is totally fake, like I just made it up for the presentation. Doesn't happen in the game. So here are the two dialogue sets. They're sticky enough already. Get it? Sticky. They've been set up to fire in script, and if we travel between the two scenes, it works as expected.
They're sticky enough already. Get it? Sticky.
But we quickly see a problem. You can fast travel to another scene in Broken Age, so it's possible that Bella will never say that first line.
Get it? Sticky.
And the second line doesn't really make sense without the first. So to fix this, we include both the first and the second line in the second dialogue set. And then we add some logic to the first dialogue set to mark that the line has finished playing. In the second dialogue set, we only play the first line if it has not yet played. And then if we want the behavior to loop, so when I was capturing the video, I could do it over and over. Just set it back to false. So here it is, problem solved.
They're sticky enough already. Get it? Sticky.
So that's the normal case, and now the fast travel.
They're sticky enough already. Get it? Sticky.
So let's say you try out the text-only approach for the dialogue in your game and decide it's just not as good as fully voiced. And my advice to you is get audio middleware. What good audio middleware does is give your audio designer, even if that's also you, much more control over the creation and implementation of sound in your game. More specifically, you'll get a sophisticated GUI tool to create, adjust, mix, organize all the sound in the game without any intervention from a programmer. It's worth stressing the importance of this. What I mean by mixing is the process of adjusting the relative volume of everything in the game so that it sounds right. And I'll have more on this a little later. There are also a lot of cool features you get out of the box that you can use for voice, like 3D positional sound, digital signal processing filters, occlusion, reverb, and so on that help give voice, or a color, give color to the voice. It will help you with things like all your sound fitting within download and memory budgets, making sure the compression introduces no noticeable artifacts, low latency for playing high demand sounds, and so on. And you'll be able to ship on many different platforms without too much work on your part. You'll also be able to use the same sound assets on high-end PCs and low-end phones because the middleware will just do its best to play the sound on however many music or sound channels a device offers. And more than anything, it just really empowers your audio designers creatively to have good tools. You'll get a much better sounding game for it, and you barely have to do a thing as a programmer. When do you not need audio middleware? Well, I guess if your game doesn't have any audio, or if it's not central to the game's experience, though I will say that many people tend to underestimate the importance of sound in their game. Maybe you're interested in writing your own audio engine, and in that case I recommend you still take a look at the feature sets of existing middleware engines just so you know what you may end up needing. Or maybe you have no money, Well, that used to be an issue, but I think Fmod Studio is completely free for games with small budgets, and engines like Unity have Fmod integration. I think same with Wise. Basically, it's worth getting because it will save you a lot of trouble. So let's get into some more specifics about the audio pipeline because it actually affects a number of disciplines aside from our audio team. So once we are ready to professionally record our lines, we use our Dialog tool to generate scripts for our studio actors that contain all the information about the lines, including any stage directions, line directions, and so on. Like, actors really like to know the context for what they're reading, so as much information about the scene as possible. And during the recording process, sometimes new lines are created that come from actor improvisation or alternative readings. Sometimes it's just a subtle change in wording, but we go back to our master list and update the text of the line to match the audio. If the line is completely new and Tim would like to keep something as an alternative reading, these lines are added as brand new line codes into the master list and will eventually need to be integrated into the game either by an animator if it's for a cutscene or a programmer if it's for dynamic dialogue. Once the lines are recorded, they're ready to be cut. This is a screenshot from an actual edit showing some of our audio team's workflow. As you can see, the original recording is intact as they edit, with the selected cuts happening in the bottom track. And the original audio is, of course, backed up on as many devices as possible, right? Because hardware failures are so common. Each line is edited pretty tightly and consistently across all lines. They will usually fade up in the beginning of the line and fade down at the end to account for any background noise or awkward breaths. And once the edits are complete, the lines are batch processed for volume normalization. Camden Stoddard, our audio director, has shared with me the magical number they use to normalize dialogue lines. It's negative or minus 4 decibels. And by the way, no matter what number here is used, some lines will have to be volume adjusted by hand. Some just won't sound right to you. For instance, any lines that have whispering, you actually want those to sound quieter because your brain will expect it. Camden had this caveat on the subject. Audio engineers are extremely cautious about normalization because there's nothing standard about the dynamics of sound. Dynamics and emotion get removed during normalization, and your brain actually prefers waveforms that have, troughs and crests and nuance. And also, when it comes to mixing the game, that is, figuring out the relative volume and focus of the sound in your game, you need to think about what is most important for you to convey. If your game is about storytelling, then dialogue trumps all. So whenever someone speaks, that line must be heard and it must sound good. And that means that you may end up spending less time on sound effect design because the player is simply not going to hear the sound effects very clearly. There'll be, dialogue playing all the time. And since we get to have the extremely talented Peter McConnell compose music for us on a lot of projects at Double Fine, and because music has so much capacity to convey emotion, music is the next most important thing when our audio designers mix the game. And then usually it's sound effects that will trump ambience. It really depends. And this could all totally be very different for your game. It's definitely something important to think about, though, even for programmers, because it informs what tools and systems you'll need to make available to your audio team for mixing and ducking sound. On Broken Age, for example, we duck our music slightly and our sound effects significantly when a line starts playing. And once you have recorded dialogue and animated characters on screen who speak, it's important to consider how this will impact animation. We actually only do temporary layouts for fully animated cutscenes in our games until the final pro voice recording comes in. The reason is that our animators use the actor performance to actually guide them in the animations. This is a quote from our lead animator on Broken Age, Raymond Crook, about just how much the voice acting informs the animation. You need to internalize the performance and translate it into something physical your characters would do as they say those lines. So if not every line in your game is in a fully animated cutscene, but you don't want the fidelity of your game to suffer, you'll need some additional systems for supporting voice lines. I mentioned before that the co-voice component can play animations associated with lines of dialogue. In Broken Age, we have many lines that are spoken outside of cutscenes. And so what we do is we request 3 talk animations from our animators. We use short talk animations for lines that are like less than 1 second long. Medium length talk animations for lines longer than 1 but less than 2 seconds. and a long talk animation for anything longer than that. We also do lip sync for our characters. In hand-animated cutscenes, our animators create the mouth and facial expressions, but for lines that play procedurally, we play additive animation for the face for each particular line. It would require quite a bit of work to hand animate every single line of dialogue, so what we do instead is run an automated process to help us generate the initial animations that our animators can then go and clean up if necessary. And the way this is done is first, our animators set up poses on each speaking character for the mouth, representing the shapes the mouth would make when generating a particular sound. That's what you see there. And then to map them to all the sounds in the particular language. The tool we use then analyzes each text and waveform for all the lines for that character and generates an animation using the provided poses. So once you commit to doing audio in your game, thinking of dialogue as a gameplay mechanic actually becomes even more important. So just like when you're doing combat mechanics, you would start with stubbed animations and poses rather than polished animations, right? You should start your dialogue implementation with scratch recordings of the lines. And what I mean is, as soon as all your dialogue systems are set up, do a recording of yourself or someone else in your team saying the lines and use that recording in your game, not just a text line. Scratch dialogue brings your game a step closer to finished. You're implementing stand-ins for what will eventually become final game assets. So you'll have a game you can demo much easier, and you'll get information like knowing exactly how large your voice banks will end up being, probably. It will help you detect and fix a number of problems that you would not have been able to solve with text-only display. You'll be able to immediately hear, for instance, if a line sounds like unnatural or just off. Certain things will become immediately obvious, like everyone is talking all over each other. That always happens. Maybe there are long, noticeable silences between sequences of conversation, and maybe you'll need to write more lines to make it sound right. Maybe a scene with dialogue drags on too long. It usually does if you have like too much exposition or something. You'll know if a line repeats too often, and this one's a real problem. And here's some advice for this. For whatever reason, the brain is very good at being able to tell that there is a lack of variety in sound, especially from a human voice. So for any emotes, record as many takes as possible. For commonly heard reactions, write at least 5 variations and use the shorter lines more often, like weigh the shorter lines so that they play more frequently. Try not to repeat jokes, they're only funny ones. Record lots of or huh type of emotes. They can be used in a lot of places. Like, so for instance, to fix some of the more repetitive sequences, or at the 11th hour when you realize you don't have a reaction for something and for some reason works. In that Boyd muttering sequence, we inserted lots of these to help stitch the lines together. Another trick is to ask the voice actor to help you out with their performance. So if you know from your scratch recording that you're going to have a line repeat a lot, you can ask the actor to give you a number of different readings of it. By the way, there's a danger to using scratch recording that I want to warn you about. You get attached. I don't know if it's because you know and love those people on the recording or because, first impressions really last or what, but there were so many times that we really missed the scratch recordings even though we knew the professional actor was better, like objectively better. And I'll give you an example. Eric Wolpa, who co-wrote Psychonauts with Tim Schafer and then went on to write Portal and Portal 2 at Valve, was in charge of scratch recording on Psychonauts. Here's our senior animator, Ray Crook, playing Raz, Tim Schafer playing the coach, and Eric playing Elton in falsetto in the intro to Basic Braining.
So this is it. The mental world.
It looks like a dentist's office.
A mental dentist office.
It's a recruiting office, kids, and I'm here to recruit you for the greatest job in the world. Being a psychonaut, it's not about science or feelings, no matter what those other camp counselors say. It's about fighting a war for mental freedom. Are you ready to face torture, insanity, death? Because this is your last chance to chicken out.
Ooh, me, sir. I'd like to chicken out, please.
Too late, soldier.
It's disarming for me to hear those recordings because I know and love those guys, but I know the game is better for having the pro actors in there, and you got to keep that in mind for your game, too. And here's what it sounded like with professional recording. And you'll notice we actually trimmed some of those lines from the scratch because we thought it was unnecessary.
So, this is it. The mental world.
It looks like a dentist office.
A mental dentist office.
It's a recruiting office, kids, and I'm here to recruit you for the greatest job in the world, being a psychonaut. It's about fighting a war for mental freedom. Are you ready to face torture, insanity, and death? Because this is your last chance to chicken out.
Oh, me, sir. I'd like to chicken out, please.
Too late, soldier!
So to conclude, I wanted to bring back this flow diagram from earlier and to fix it so it represents the reality of working with dialogue a little bit better. So I'll leave the beginning the same, but I'll say that starting with writing is just a thing for some games, but for others, maybe the best thing is to sit down with the game and see where writing would really add to the experience. The next thing should definitely be to hook up the lines in the game, although this is more descriptive in terms of what you should be thinking about at this point. Getting the lines in the game as early as possible is very important, so you should start with something simple and build from there. And it's entirely possible that this might happen, that hooking up the lines will make you reconsider how you're writing the game or will spur you on to write more. Pretty quickly, you'll need to add tracking lines as part of your process. And you should create a master list of all the dialogue, and I recommend a unique ID for each line and using that code when implementing. And at this stage, you should be able to decide what dialogue systems your game will need. Maybe you will need your characters to animate when the line is kicked off, or maybe you'll need a fancy way to display in the line a line that requires player input to continue. Or maybe it's a dynamic dialogue system. And building those systems, whatever your game needs to do dialogue well, also becomes an important part of the process. It helps you author dialogue more quickly and to represent it in the game in ever more sophisticated ways. If you should decide to do voice dialogue, you will need to beef up your entire pipeline to account for the editing, tracking, and implementing the voice lines. And you should get audio middleware to make it easier to do sound in your game. And make time in your schedule for your audio team to edit the lines. Do scratch recording as early as possible to work out the kinks in the audio and writing. And the most important thing, think of dialogue as something that is integral to the core experience, like a game mechanic. If you plan to do dialogue or plan to include dialogue, you should start thinking about how it will work in your game as early as possible so that the narrative comes together holistically with all the other mechanics. I hope you found this useful. Thank you so much.